We had learned to read rivers the way infantry learns to read terrain. A river was not just water. It was time. It was distance. It was delay. When an enemy reached a river, they slowed. When they slowed, they died. That was the logic drilled into us through years of doctrine, exercises, and blood. You did not rush a defended crossing. You shelled it. You smoked it. You crept across it in fragile boats while men fell into the water and disappeared. Rivers punished impatience. Rivers favored the defender. By 1945, we believed this as firmly as gravity. Along the eastern bank, we had positions prepared with care that bordered on ritual. Machine guns sighted along the waterline. Anti-tank weapons angled toward the far shore. Artillery coordinates measured and rehearsed until the numbers lived in our heads. We knew where the Americans would come from, how long it would take them, and how many of them we could kill before they reached us. Every war has its illusions. Ours was certainty. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Dawn came with mist clinging to the river's surface, the kind that muffles sound and narrows vision. We listened more than we watched. Boats announce themselves. Engines complain. Metal vibrates. You hear crossings before you see them. That morning, the sound reached us, but it did not match anything we knew. It was too deep for an outboard, too fast for a barge, too steady for panic, a mechanical growl that cut through the fog and refused to slow. We leaned forward in our positions, trying to make sense of it. Men muttered guesses. Patrol craft. Minesweepers. Some new American boat we had not yet cataloged. None of the answers mattered, because all of them assumed the same thing. Whatever it was, it would behave like a boat. Then it broke through the mist. What came toward us did not fit the water. It did not sit in it the way vessels should. It skimmed, almost floating above the surface, throwing a hard wake behind it as it accelerated. And on top of it was a shape my mind rejected before my eyes could argue otherwise. A turret. Not a gun mount, not a naval cannon. A tank turret, squat, armored, familiar in every detail, except the one detail that mattered most. It was moving. The moment stretched, not because time slowed, but because thought did. Training fought reality. Every instinct reached for a rule that could explain what we were seeing. Tanks do not cross rivers like this. Boats do not carry weapons like that. Guns that size require stillness. Recoil demands mass. Accuracy demands stability. These were not theories. They were facts. Written into the dead. The turret turned, not slowly, not searching. It rotated with confidence, tracking positions along the bank as if the river itself were irrelevant. The craft did not stop. It did not reduce speed. It came on harder, faster than anything we had prepared to engage. Someone shouted. Orders collided. Range estimates meant nothing when the target refused to behave. You cannot lead something you do not understand. You cannot wait for it to expose itself when it never pauses long enough to be vulnerable. The gun fired. The blast was wrong. Too sharp. Too close. The impact tore into the bank short of our position, throwing mud and fragments into the air. The water around the craft erupted with spray as it kept moving, unchanged, unbothered, already adjusting its line. Before we could react, another followed, and then another shape emerged from the fog behind it. Now there were several of them. They did not advance in a line. They spread. Each moved independently, weaving across the river at a speed that destroyed our firing solutions as fast as we could calculate them. Our weapons were aimed at where they had been, not where they were. Every shot chased ghosts. In those first seconds, we did not think in terms of defeat. We thought in terms of error. Surely this was a trick of perception. Fatigue, poor visibility, but the explosions were real. The splintering of concrete was real. Men pulling themselves deeper into the earth as fragments passed overhead was very real. What frightened us was not the damage. It was the implication. If this was possible, then everything we had prepared for was wrong. Rivers were supposed to slow attackers. These things used the river as open ground. Defensive fire was supposed to punish movement. Speed turned movement into protection. Armor was meant to survive hits. They survived by refusing to be hit at all. In that moment, before anyone knew what these machines were or where they came from, the line was already compromised, not because it had been overrun, but because it no longer made sense. Doctrine relies on predictability. Once predictability collapses, confidence follows it into the water. We were watching a weapon that did not seek to fight our defenses. It ignored them, and as it closed the distance in seconds that should have taken minutes, one thought cut through the noise, clearer than fear. If the enemy was willing to violate rules this fundamental, then there were no safe assumptions left. The river had failed us, and whatever was coming next would not be stopped by what we had prepared behind it. Training is built on repetition. You learn how a thing behaves, and you practice the response until it becomes instinct. In battle, instinct matters more than intelligence. There is no time to reason through manuals when seconds decide who remains standing. Against conventional river crossings, our instincts were sharp. Boats slow as they approach shore. Crews expose themselves. Guns overheat. Targets linger just long enough to be destroyed. We had rehearsed this sequence so often that it felt inevitable. What we were facing erased that sequence completely. The first reaction was to engage as we always had. Machine guns opened fire along the waterline, stitching lines where boats should be crossing. Tracers skimmed the surface, marking calculations that assumed hesitation. But the craft did not hesitate. They did not bunch up. They did not present clean angles. They cut across the river at speeds that collapsed our timing before it could settle. You cannot correct fire fast enough when the target is already somewhere else. Anti-tank weapons followed. Crews swung heavy barrels toward the river, struggling to track something that refused to move like armor or vessel. These guns were designed to ambush mass, to wait, to fire once, decisively. But there was no pause to exploit. The sight picture never stabilized. The moment the crosshairs aligned, the target had already shifted. The river distorted distance. Speed compressed it. Our ranging became meaningless. Artillery calls were shouted, but artillery is a conversation with time. Coordinates must be passed. Guns must traverse. Fuses must be set. The river was wide, but the engagement was already happening inside those steps. By the time batteries could respond, the craft were no longer where they had been reported. Every system we relied on assumed an attacker who would move cautiously. These machines attacked like they had nothing to lose. Men began to realize the problem was not accuracy or courage. It was relevance. Our weapons were sound. Our positions were strong. But the conditions we had prepared for no longer existed. We were trying to solve a problem that had already changed shape. The speed did more than frustrate our aim. It dismantled our confidence. Fire discipline collapsed because discipline depends on expectation. When soldiers believe a target will slow, they wait for the perfect moment. When it does not, they fire too early, too late, or not at all. Shouts overlapped. Commands contradicted one another. No one wanted to be the man who hesitated, yet no one knew when hesitation had become fatal. The craft used movement the way armor uses steel. They did not linger to trade fire. They did not seek cover because they did not need it. Each pass was brief, violent, and disorienting. They appeared, struck, and were already withdrawing as the brain tried to catch up. By the time we recalculated, they were preparing another approach from a different angle. This was not an assault designed to overwhelm us with mass. It was designed to deny us comprehension. For years, we had been taught that vulnerability was unavoidable during river crossings. That was the price of movement. These attackers reversed the equation. Their movement was their protection. Their exposure window was so narrow that survival no longer depended on armor thickness or fortification depth, but on whether we could think faster than they could move. We could not. Each failed attempt to stop them reinforced the same realization. Our defenses were not being tested, being bypassed conceptually. We had prepared answers to questions the enemy was no longer asking. As more of the craft cut across the river, something else became clear. They were not improvising. Their movements were deliberate, coordinated. Each approach forced us to reveal positions, and each withdrawal punished those revelations. The riverbank that had felt solid minutes earlier now felt transparent. We were no longer defenders controlling space. We were targets reacting to motion. Fear spread not as panic, but as doubt. Doubt about whether any response we made still mattered. Once doubt enters a defensive line, it widens gaps faster than artillery ever could. Men begin to conserve themselves instead of the position. They pull inward. They wait for clarity that never comes. The enemy had achieved something rare in warfare. They had not just outgunned us. They had removed the logic that justified resistance. In those moments, before anyone could name the weapon or explain its design, the outcome was already tilting. Not because we lacked courage, but because courage without understanding becomes waste. And understanding was being stripped away with every high-speed pass across the water. We were no longer fighting a crossing. We were reacting to a phenomenon. And when soldiers reach that point, when the battle ceases to feel like a contest and begins to feel like an event unfolding beyond control, the defensive line has already begun to dissolve. Whatever these machines were, they had found a way to turn one of our greatest advantages into an open road. And we were standing in its path, still waiting for rules that were never coming back. Only later did we understand that what we faced was not confidence born of superiority, but urgency born of limitation. At the time, it felt deliberate, even arrogant, as if the Americans had discovered some hidden law of war we had missed. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. They were running out of patience. By the final year of the war, every river in Europe had become a graveyard of assumptions. Each crossing cost time. Each delay gave defenders another night to dig, another chance to bring up guns, another opportunity to turn water into a killing ground. Artillery could soften positions, but it could not move. Aircraft could strike, but only briefly. And the men in landing craft paid the price for every meter of hesitation. The Americans understood this problem clearly. They did not see rivers as obstacles to be endured. They saw them as bottlenecks that had to be broken quickly, violently, and without negotiation. What they needed was not a new doctrine. It was a shortcut through inevitability. Landing craft were plentiful, but fragile. Tanks were powerful, but trapped by terrain. The traditional answer was coordination: boats bring men, tanks arrive later, artillery prepares the way. But coordination takes time. And time was the currency the Americans were no longer willing to spend. So they asked a question that violated common sense. If a boat could carry a tank, why could it not become one? To anyone raised on proper distinctions, naval and land, hull and armor, mobility and firepower, the idea was absurd. Boats were not built to absorb recoil. Water punished imbalance. Guns of that size demanded stillness and mass. Everything about the proposal conflicted with what engineers, sailors, and soldiers believed to be true. That is why it worked. Innovation in war rarely comes from certainty. It comes from desperation, combined with industry. The Americans had both. They were not searching for elegance. They were searching for results. And they possessed something we underestimated until it was too late: the willingness to destroy boundaries between branches, disciplines, and traditions. They did not invent a new gun. They did not invent a new boat. They fused what already existed into something that doctrine said should not survive its first firing. Those vessels we saw on the river were not prototypes. They did not hesitate because they had already failed in controlled conditions and been forced to improve. By the time they reached us, their creators had accepted instability as a price worth paying and had learned how to tame it just enough. The purpose was never longevity. It was shock. Shock at the moment when defenders believed themselves strongest. At the instant where resistance expected predictability. By placing armored firepower onto speed rather than protection, they inverted the logic of defense. Instead of enduring incoming fire, they denied us the opportunity to deliver it effectively. Instead of waiting for artillery to shape the battlefield, they shaped it themselves in seconds. We had assumed that the Americans would fight rivers the way everyone else had, with preparation, with caution, with losses accepted as unavoidable. Instead, they chose to collapse the entire problem into motion. From our side of the water, it looked like madness refined into precision. These machines did not exist to hold ground. They existed to erase hesitation. They were not meant to survive prolonged engagement. They were meant to appear where survival calculations had not yet formed. Only later did we learn how narrow the margins truly were, how close these vessels had come to failure in their earliest trials, how often their creators were told it could not be done safely or at all. But safety was never the goal. Dominance during the crossing was. That realization carried its own weight, because if the Americans were willing to gamble this much engineering effort and risk simply to cross rivers faster, then the war had entered a phase where convention no longer restrained them. They were no longer adapting to battlefields. They were redesigning them. And when a power reaches that stage, when it stops asking how to fight within the rules and starts asking which rules are worth keeping, defenders find themselves reacting not to tactics but to philosophy. We had trained to resist force. We were now facing intent. The first time they were used as more than an experiment, the river stopped being an obstacle. It became a corridor. Until then, every crossing followed a rhythm everyone understood. Fire softened the bank. Smoke tried to blind it. Boats moved cautiously, packed with men who knew they were exposed. Defenders measured success in minutes, survived. Attackers measured it in bodies lost. It was a brutal balance, but it was familiar. The Americans broke that rhythm. Instead of waiting for preparation to finish, these machines went first, not after the barrage, not alongside the smoke, ahead of everything. They did not creep forward. They charged. From the bank it looked reckless, a handful of fast-moving shapes racing into a defended line without pause or cover. For a moment we believed they were sacrificing themselves. That belief lasted only until the first impacts landed where our strongest positions had been. The guns did not fire randomly. They fired with purpose. Bunkers, strong points, the places where defenders felt safest. Each shot arrived before we could adjust, before we could warn adjacent positions, before we could understand the pattern. They were not trying to destroy everything. They were carving holes. As the craft swept across the river, they did not linger to confirm kills. They did not wait to be engaged. They fired, shifted, fired again, and vanished into motion. By the time smoke and debris settled, the riverbank no longer functioned as a continuous line. It was a series of isolated pockets, each uncertain of what had happened to the next. That fragmentation was fatal. Defensive systems depend on connection. One bunker covers another. One gun watches the flank of the next. Once those links are severed, strength becomes irrelevant. Isolated positions fight bravely but blindly. They fire into spaces already abandoned or into angles already bypassed. The craft exploited this mercilessly. They returned again and again, never from the same direction, never at the same speed. Each pass forced us to reveal ourselves, and each revelation was punished. Men stopped firing not because they lacked ammunition, but because every shot felt like an invitation. What had been a defense became a reaction. Behind them, something worse followed. Conventional landing craft began to appear, moving into gaps that should not have existed yet. Troops reached the far bank with fewer losses than we believed possible, advancing through corridors opened by violence that had arrived too fast to counter. We understood then that these machines were not meant to win battles alone. They were meant to make battles one-sided before they truly began. By the time we tried to reorganize, the moment had passed. Artillery arrived late. Fire chased shadows. Orders were issued for conditions that no longer applied. The crossing was already happening, not because resistance had ceased, but because it had been stripped of coherence. Speed had replaced preparation. Movement had replaced protection. The river, once a shield, had been turned against us. It no longer slowed the enemy. It accelerated him. In those hours, the lesson became impossible to ignore. Defense is strongest when it controls time. These machines stole time faster than we could recover it. They compressed hours of expected engagement into minutes of irreversible change. When the first wave of infantry secured ground on the eastern bank, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Not because we had been annihilated, but because the conditions required to stop them had never existed long enough to matter. Later, historians would count destroyed positions and calculate losses avoided. They would argue about efficiency and innovation, but from where we lay on the riverbank, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a handful of fast-moving machines had arrived first, struck hard, and left us fighting a battle whose opening act we had already lost. The crossing did not succeed because of overwhelming numbers. It succeeded because the enemy understood something we did not until it was too late. If you control the first minutes, you control everything that follows. After the crossings, the rivers changed character. They were still water, still wide, still cold. But they no longer felt defensive. They felt exposed. Men who had once taken comfort in a river line now watched it with unease, as if it might turn against them at any moment. Fear in war is not panic. Panic is loud and brief. Fear is quieter. It settles in and reshapes behavior. That was what these machines created. Not terror, but uncertainty. The kind that follows soldiers into their positions and refuses to leave. Word traveled faster than reports, faster than orders, faster even than retreat. Units that had not yet encountered the craft heard about them anyway. Stories spread, distorted by distance but sharpened by imagination. Boats that outran bullets, guns that fired while moving. Positions erased before defenders understood what was happening. The details varied. The conclusion did not. Rivers were no longer predictable. Commanders tried to respond the only way doctrine allowed. More guns were moved forward. Anti-aircraft weapons were redirected toward the water on the hope that something designed to track aircraft might track speed. Anti-tank guns were repositioned closer to the bank, accepting vulnerability in exchange for reaction time. Mines were laid where possible, not to deny crossings entirely, but to restore the sense that water could still punish recklessness. None of it restored confidence. Every countermeasure assumed time. Time to detect. Time to aim. Time to fire. But time was exactly what these machines denied. Engagement windows were too short. Angles changed too quickly. And when a hit was not immediate, the craft were already gone, leaving only noise and confusion behind. Men began to hesitate even when nothing appeared. Sentries watched mist longer than they should have. Gunners kept fingers tight on triggers, waiting for shapes that might never come. Positions stayed alert, not because orders demanded it, but because rest felt dangerous. This constant tension eroded discipline in subtle ways. Fatigue set in. Reactions slowed. Judgment dulled. Soldiers who sleep poorly do not think clearly. Soldiers who do not think clearly fire late or early or at the wrong thing altogether. That was the true damage. The craft did not need to appear every night. The possibility was enough. The river became a threat that could activate without warning, a surface that might suddenly produce speed and firepower in defiance of experience. We began to defend everywhere at once. And when you defend everywhere, you defend nowhere well. Strategically, the effect was just as corrosive. River lines that had once been chosen deliberately began to feel like liabilities. Positions that should have been held were abandoned early. Withdrawals happened sooner than planned, not because pressure was overwhelming, but because confidence had evaporated. Better to fall back than to wait for something that could not be predicted or countered reliably. On the American side, this hesitation was invisible. They saw positions thinning, resistance weakening, crossings succeeding with fewer losses. They did not see the nights of uncertainty or the calculations that ended in doubt. But the outcome was clear. A weapon that rarely stayed in place had anchored itself in our thinking. Even when the craft were absent, they shaped decisions. This is how wars tilt, not through decisive battles alone, but through accumulated moments where one side stops trusting its own assumptions. When soldiers no longer believe the ground beneath them behaves as expected, they stop believing in the plans built upon it. Rivers had once given us time to think. Now they stole it. And in war, the side that steals time does not need to win every fight. It only needs to arrive before understanding can catch up. When the war ended, the rivers grew quiet again. The smoke lifted. The wreckage was cleared. Bridges were rebuilt where they had been shattered. On maps, the crossings returned to being lines and symbols, neat and abstract. But for those who had defended them, something fundamental had shifted. We had learned that the enemy did not need to defeat us everywhere. He only needed to break the logic that told us where we were safe. Those machines appeared late in the war in numbers too small to change its outcome on their own. Yet their significance was never measured in quantity. It was measured in what they proved possible. They demonstrated that protection could come from speed instead of armor, that firepower could be liberated from stillness, and that rigid boundaries between land and water, army and navy could be ignored when they became inconvenient. They showed that doctrine is not a shield, it is a habit. And habits can be exploited. The Americans did not invent a new category of weapon so much as they rejected an old way of thinking. They took what already existed, combined it without asking permission, and accepted instability in exchange for dominance at the decisive moment. That willingness to trade comfort for advantage was something we struggled to counter, not because we lacked intelligence or courage, but because our thinking remained constrained by what had always been done before. After the war, historians would trace the lineage of those river assaults forward, to later conflicts, to later doctrines, to new vessels built on the same idea: move fast, hit hard, disappear before the enemy can respond. The shapes changed, the technology advanced, but the principle endured. Speed as protection, surprise as armor, integration as a weapon. Standing on the banks after it was all over, it became clear that the true legacy of those river crossings was not measured in destroyed positions or casualties avoided, but in a quiet realization. The war had been lost not when the last defenses fell, but when we encountered an enemy willing to abandon assumptions we still treated as laws. The rivers had not failed us. We had failed to imagine what could cross them. And in war, the side that imagines first, who refuses to accept that something cannot be done simply because it never has been, will always arrive with the advantage. Long after the engines went silent and the guns were dismantled, that lesson remained, not as a memory of fear, but as a warning. Victory does not always belong to the strongest force or the most experienced one. It belongs to those who are willing to question the ground beneath their feet before the enemy does it for them. That was the true meaning of the river demons. Not monsters born of metal and speed, but proof that once certainty is broken, the course of a war can change faster than any current.